this text, Isaiah, with allusions to events of the past, the prophet describes the Lord God through the past actions of God. The prophet describes God as one who makes a way for us when an exit strategy seems impossible. God, whom the prophet declares is about to speak, is described as an undefeatable warrior. In an age where we understand warfare to be highly technological and mechanized, where biological manipulations become the next weapon of mass destruction, the description of the prophet continues to define God as greater. Considering what human ingenuity is capable of, it's difficult for many to imagine a God who is capable of doing more than we are in an effort to overcome obstacles of nature. We build massive ships that travel on the water. We build powerful submarines that stealthily move under the water. Both ship and submarine carry the most powerful weapons known to humankind, including armed forces capable of cutting a path of destruction. And I'm sorry, I just have to throw this out. As I was going through and preparing, I also thought, well, we don't carry horses on ships anymore. In spite of our stated superiority, because we can do all of these things, we are superior. In spite of our stated superiority, the levees of New Orleans did break. And other structures designed to withstand great waters did erode. Ships can sink. Submarines can be crushed by water pressure. They can only go so deep. And no army is invincible. Nevertheless, God is declared as the one who is able to control the great waters and has power over nature. The prophet's description of God, which is grounded in salvation history, declares that God can control the power of human innovations and the war machine. If we expect the description of the prophet if we accept the description of the prophet, there is nothing in all our might that we can do against God that God will not experience as anything more than a minor irritation. Our fires, initiated by napalm, are as the wick of an oil lamp that God would easily snuff out. Although the prophet seems to be alluding to things of the past, the prophet declares that God says, "Do not remember the events of the past," which seems kind of odd to say that we should not remember the things of the past, because memory can be a strength and a resource for survival. Memory can provide a reference point for interpreting events and life circumstances. But remembering the things of the past, one can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Remembering one's mistakes can lead to greater successes in one's future. But what I think the prophet is also trying to let us know is that memory can also be a hindrance. Continuing to hold on to a narrative too tightly can cause one to be stuck in time. Clinging too tightly to a memory can also cause a person to misinterpret life. If you hold too closely to the former things, you will not be able to embrace new things. This is, in fact, the critique of many as relates to the importance of civil rights history, as it has relevance for today. Is our reference and remembrance of civil rights backwards thinking? Or is it preserving? The Lord declares, I'm about to do a new thing. The statement suggests a future action of God. But God goes on to say, a new thing now. It's not simply a future promise. It is a present and the immediate reality. It is here, but not yet. The Lord cares for and restores the chosen by being present as a sustaining spirit to encourage their hopeful resistance. Believing God is doing a new thing in the here and now while experiencing a visionary hope to glimpse the future. God inspires an eschatological hope that liberates believers from glorifying the past. An eschatological hope fixes our eyes on glorifying God as we witness God doing a new thing. So those are just a few reflections from the first reading. Any responses to that? Thoughts, comments? And we've been asked to come to the mic if you haven't.
Back a little bit.
Yes?
Did you say about the children die? The last year, 344 children died for problems with gangs. The last year in all the country. I want to back a little bit because the suicide is like an epidemic now. I go very often to South Dakota. I part to the Lakota tradition. And a lot of young men and young women commit suicide there. Mm. And here even, I have a patient, and sometimes one of the mothers go to my office because one of her children killed himself, 12 years old in Indiana. But the problem is a syndrome, this vinculation, reactive vinculation, when they are very young, because they don't receive affection. And the problem with the young men are killing people now during these last years in the universities, and also the last one in Connecticut, is because these young men don't receive any affection from the mother. Mm. And that's why I try to start really working with parents.
Yes.
About feelings, because the people disconnect. When the children play games, they are really, when they're killing the screens, they can do outside, and they don't have any feelings. And I know another young man, he was adopted for 6 families in different years, and I see how he don't have any feelings, and was because that they give in adoption in internet. One to my uncles adopt him by internet, and he don't have any feelings. And I see very close because he's like my nephew. No, not my blood nephew, but it's, you know. But this, I think we need to start, like you said, and I am so glad you give this talk today. I really appreciate it, Doctor. Because we need to start, because everything starts from the uterus. How are the feelings from the mothers when they go to have a baby? And this lens, we can make the reflection with the students and the people that are close to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Butler, in what ways do we stay frozen in the civil rights movement? You mentioned that we can get stuck back there. And in what ways were you speaking? Is it romanticization of it, or is it just what we would be getting ready to do next week with Dr. King Day and that kind of thing? How do we get stuck back there, and how are new things prevented from happening because of that?
To the first comment from our sister, part of what she was sharing with us is this idea that we are cultivating, I'll say, a new generation of sociopaths. Because they have not learned how to feel. And even if they would have a feeling, it wouldn't be concerned about another. That there is this sense in which they don't care about the feelings of others. And so it has been explored, to what extent are we creating a new generation of sociopaths? And so she's suggesting to us that we have to not go back to the cradle, but even before the cradle, to neonatal sorts of ways of caring for the new life that is to come, for the next generation. So we thank you for that input. And with the second comment and question, I know it's a tightrope we walk there of holding on to a story that is valuable, important, that we honor, and raising the question of, is this story still a story that is progressive or is it regressive? And part of what has me raising the question is because we did hit a point in our sharing of the educating our community, where the story was not told, neither was it experienced as the same motivating story that other generations had with it. So for me, the story is one that will still bring tears to my eyes. But we have another generation that says, so what? And so for them to say, so what, while it makes me cry, there's now a disconnect within the community that says, okay, am I holding to this story so tightly that we are not advancing because I can't even communicate with the new generation? And we are also, as we approach the scripture, we're always saying that there's something new to be seen within the Scripture because it's a living document. There's something new to be experienced by engaging the text because it is alive. To what extent are we holding that story as a living, breathing story? Or are we still holding it in a place that there's nothing that ever changes, therefore we have to preserve it as is, as opposed to having new elements of that story come out and inspire us anew, inspire a new generation? And so by reading the text, I simply just wanted to raise the question, as the prophet raises this question about us holding so tightly to the old that we cannot see that God is still speaking and doing. It's like we have our litany of saints related to the story of civil rights, human rights. And we always stop at a point. Are there no more saints? Aren't there more people that are doing the work that we can point to as doing the work and still laying down their lives for their friends? We can hold so tightly that we don't see it as an ongoing, evolving, living, breathing story. Last comment on this. When the Gina, Louisiana issue was very much alive, there were folks who were identifying that moment as the new civil rights movement. And for some, it was needed to be acknowledged as a new civil rights movement because it helped them to rekindle their old feelings with the old civil rights movement, as opposed to seeing this as its ongoing work for justice. Clinging to the old so tightly that we can't see that there is work that needs to go on, there's work that is being done. And so I just raised the question. Other questions? Yes?
As we prepare for King Day and this question, last year on our Lenten study, we did Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and just the kind of thinking of the reality of mass incarceration and how that how do we understand the struggle against mass incarceration as the new system of racial control, and how does the story of the civil rights epic of the 50s and 60s really inform the story of dismantling mass incarceration and finding ways to link that with mass detention, with the black-brown solidarity, some of the exciting stuff that was done at UIC a year ago with bringing those two together. And then the, so looking at that, and then the question of, you mentioned civil rights, human rights, and as we have, how do we, as Dr. King in his last gathering with SCLC staff in the last retreat said, we have to move beyond the Constitution and civil rights to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and human rights as what's going to carry us in. I don't think we've really found a way to incorporate that into the narrative, and so that the narrative becomes one of not just civil rights in our nationalist piece, but how do we tell the story of human rights in terms of the human family and in terms of a country that's in perpetual war, slaughtering people around the world, the capacity to have drone attacks, and there's no, I mean, what is it to claim that story moving to human rights and the human family, I think is a challenge to us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so I move to our next reading, the Psalm, and this Psalm and my reflection of the Psalm speaks directly to the last parts of our conversation. Psalm 126. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. And then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoice. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses in the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed of sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. When God caused people to experience reversal of fortunes by restoring all that they had lost, the astonishment of the people caused them to experience a moment, or experience the moment as a dream. They experienced the moment as a future hope not yet realized. Most people understand dreaming as an act of living into one's deepest hopes and desires in a fanciful way. A dream, therefore, can be the unconscious experience of acting out what one hopes will become one's lived experience. Once their fortunes had been restored, the people thought, this can't be real. America, as the land of dreamers, knows this experience quite well. Many Americans continue to actualize the American dream of prosperity. When Senator Barack Obama became the first African-American president of the United States, the language of dream dominated the moment. The deep emotions associated with being African-American, coupled with a long struggle for human and civil rights, gave the experience of the moment a surreal quality. This was a dream that was no longer deferred, but the initial experience was astonishment. The moment was experienced by many as though God had restored our fortunes. The moment was identified as a dream come true. Voice after voice. There was one little cartoon that I remember. It was of King. And it showed him pinching himself. He said, am I dreaming? This sense of that which we longed for has finally happened, and I can't believe it's arrived. This moment of astonishment. The people realizing that they were not asleep, they thought, or they were not dreaming something that wasn't real, began to celebrate with laughter and much merrymaking. When people celebrate with good cause, others will look and affirmed the importance of the celebration. As it was true for the psalmist, nations from around the globe gazed upon the United States and declared a marvelous thing had been done through our election process. World leaders viewed the American people as having taken an important step in our own development as a nation. It is important that we acknowledge and accept the great gifts given us by God. In our acceptance, we ought to also rejoice and give thanks. Although our labors have been difficult, our hope in God leads us to believe that our harvest will be bountiful. Therefore, we ought to continue laboring and hoping in spite of the challenges and adversities, knowing that God will give us bountiful blessings in return. Psalm 126. Any thoughts, reflections, comments, questions? Again, these reflections that I'm sharing with you are pastoral theological. They are using theology, which I'm saying is largely liberation theology, using psychology to interpret the feelings of the text as well as the images of the text, and placing them in a context of ministry, of what we can do, might do, should do. Yeah.
I just want to say how this continues to reflect on the ones that you've brought up before, that it's in the light of the past. It talks about the tears that we had, and the extreme joy and rejoicing that comes because of the grief that we had in the past. As a hospice chaplain, I definitely have experienced how you talk about healing is living, but it comes as we recognize and accept and allow ourselves to fully experience the pain of what we have been through. And I saw how people couldn't find healing or growth from the painful experiences because they never would allow themselves to experience the fullness of the pain. And you know, I was with someone who I saw being very much this way, and there was no particular emotion. I said, well, how did you deal with the painful experiences of the past? You know, thinking that could help him to deal with what he was going through now. And he said, well, I never really had any painful experiences. I've had a good life. And then he started telling his story, and oh my goodness, what have you been through? But it was because he wouldn't allow himself to go to the depth. And because he was never in the depth, he never got to have the mountain.
Okay.
He never recognized the dream of the fulfillment of the dream and the fullness of the joy, the fullness of the healing.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Other sharing?
So moving forward, I think my only question now becomes working in faith communities where we don't want to hold on to a past epic or a past experience and substitute that now for the work that we're doing, moving towards justice and moving in terms of a spirit that's not one where we cloister ourselves in the name of the spiritual discipline associated around the Lenten season, but moving towards one where the work of sacrifice is one that moves towards establishing justice and right relationships. How do we move from a place where we are in communities that might tend to make that substitution and association, where we see injustice that is a current and ongoing part of our reality, but we may want to revert back to patterns and hold on to feelings for past epics? How do we move forward into feeling those new feelings of suffering and to reap the new joys and move forward in a progressive way?
Okay. First, let me say another word about story and how we hold on to our stories. Because indeed, our stories reflect our experiences and are a part and sometimes the sum total of who we are. So I would not want to say that you just completely give up the story, that you completely deny the story, but it is how you embrace and use the story that becomes important. Some stories can be so powerful that they overpower us, and they can keep us from growing. They can inhibit us. They stop us from taking the next step in our own maturation, in our own development. And so when the story controls us in a way that keeps us from becoming fully human and living fully alive, that's the story that really needs to be reformed. There are stories, however, that become so inspirational that they become motivating, that they become our symbols for living. But even then, we have to be able to augment the story so it doesn't become static but remains very dynamic and continues to inspire us because it becomes an ever-growing story. And so we have to learn how to mediate between these, to recognize and not allow the story to reduce us, but to be an ever-expanding part of us. Toward the tail end of your question, you began to raise this concern, however, that sometimes we can have a story that has been motivating to us, but then something can happen that seems to stop our growth, that seems to close us off as a way of regrouping. And that's where we have to be concerned. We should not ever allow experiences, negative experiences in particular, negative experiences to control us to such an extent that they cause us to retreat from life, that they cause us to isolate ourselves from life. Because when we look at the narrative, the biblical record, and one of the lessons it gives to us is that when you isolate, separate, no longer have relationship, that space becomes the space of death. Complete isolation is equal to death. And so when you isolate yourself by virtue of that story that you're clinging to, by virtue of that experience that was quite profoundly painful, you write your own death sentence. And so many of us, many institutions, in fact, will choose death. They'll write their own death sentence because the crisis has come, and rather than meeting the challenge, they go backwards, grabbing those things that they consider to be the most meaningful, and then they huddle, isolate, and try and protect that last little talent. And in doing so, they cut off the possibilities for living. One of my institutions, academic institutions, when I was there, I loved the place. Economic crisis hit the institution, and what it became is not recognizable from when I was there. Why? Because rather than meeting the crisis and understanding God to be a God that can open new doors and new opportunities, they reverted back to an earlier time in the history when they were far more conservative rather than far more progressive, believing that becoming more conservative would allow the windows of heaven to open up and pour them out a blessing that they would not have room enough to receive. But if you are closing off, how can you receive anything? But they went back to claim a story which caused them to regress. And so we have to be careful with how we use the story and how the story reforms us or forms us. So to that, I guess I just want to say that we must become more vulnerable. And that was a part of what I was alluding to earlier about the community, folks being safe in the community and being open in community, that we have to be vulnerable and risk being hurt if we're going to know life. If there's going to be a possibility of something new, we have to open ourselves up, expose ourselves, be vulnerable, and that's what allows for something new. And it's difficult to say that in a world that is filled with violence. Because the idea of being vulnerable says you're being stupid. And so all I can say to that is, what's the scripture declare? Be wise and be gentle. Wise and gentle. And being wise and gentle doesn't mean that you are putting yourself in harm's way. But it also doesn't mean that you're going to close yourself off in the name of protection. I hope I got at what you're asking. I'm looking at our time, and there are two more lectionary readings left. There is the second reading, which is from the letter to the Philippians, and there is the gospel reading, which is from the gospel according to St. John. Watching our time, do you have a preference for which one I do? John. Okay, the gospel it is. John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for Lazarus and Jesus. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So Jesus arrives in Bethany 6 days before the Passover. The identification of 6 days is possibly a reference to the importance of laboring for 6 days and resting on the seventh. We must always remember to keep the Sabbath day holy. Jesus is once again at the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Lazarus is at the dinner table with Jesus as a living testimony of the power of life over death. We see in Lazarus that it is possible to be freed from the grip of death. Because so many of us are so consumed by death that is our first and our last thought. That all of our activities are centered around, focused upon death and trying to cheat death. The ways we will adorn ourselves and change our features and invest our money trying to escape death. As the narrative develops, Mary and Judas are introduced to the story. Now, there's an inclination to associate Mary's costly perfume with Judas. That is, when you're reading this text, because of the way it begins to develop, you can begin to associate Mary and the perfume with Judas, which shifts the attention away from Lazarus. So we have to always, as we're reading the text, particularly when we're reading it from this perspective of pastoral care, we have to always keep in mind and pay attention to who's in the room and who's experiencing what in the room. And sometimes in our reading, we hear Judas's name, and now suddenly Judas becomes the identified patient that captures all of our attention. And we forget that this was very much a party for Lazarus. If, however, the costly perfume is associated with Lazarus rather than Judas, it's a beautiful fragrance that takes on different meaning. Before Lazarus was raised from the dead, the people were hesitant to roll back the stone from the grave, commenting that Lazarus by this time would be stinking from decay. Following the direction of Jesus, the stone was removed and Lazarus' decaying body was restored to life. As a result, the dinner in honor of Jesus was accompanied by a sweet-smelling fragrance. Rather than the house being filled with the stench of death and the feeling of death, the perfume filled the house in a celebration of life. It inspired everyone in the house to celebrate life with the food, with the sweet-smelling fragrance, with folks being attended to. Instead of the costly perfume attempting to mask the presence of death, it participated in the celebration of life being restored. Judas, the conflicted disciple, was also a part of this celebration. Although this text presents Judas as a thief, there are many different opinions about Judas and Judas's life, his motivations. There's no clear evidence to indicate that Judas would have been the one to sell the perfume and disperse the proceeds to the poor. Furthermore, the question seems a bit odd in light of Jesus saying that Mary bought the perfume. Jesus goes on further to say that she bought it to keep for the day of his burial. The fact that she chooses to use it at this dinner suggests that she chose to give Jesus his flowers while he was alive. This was a celebration of life, in appreciation for the gift of life that she received through her brother being raised from the dead. There you have it. Any thoughts or reflections, questions?
You know, I always question the first incident where Jesus said the poor. You will always. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe that's good. Okay, when Jesus said the poor you will have with us, and I always thought, you know, he was referring to the masses of the poor. But then listening to the argument for Judas saying something about the money and the person, that he was a thief. And I think about big business now, and I think about enterprising. Who was he calling the poor? I mean, were the poor in spirit, the poor in ethics, the poor in distribution, the poor in sharing the wealth? And I know that was way ahead of enterprise and what's going on today, but then Jesus was way ahead of his time anyway. So I always just take him and put him in the modern present. And I just think that perhaps he was speaking of the fact that the real poor are not the people without wealth. The real poor are the people who withhold everything that is needed for others to will not share the wealth, and will not see how the wealth can be shared. And so I took that, you know, because it was a basic interpretation, but I never want to put Jesus with basics. So I always make him Superman, way ahead of everything. You know, I mean, he's right here. So he really meant what's going on right now with big business and, you know, all sorts of lobbies and all sorts of withholding of the wealth so that it isn't spread among the poor. Who is really poor is my question for that particular thing. And I want to know, you know, how you feel about that particular era, grudging attitude and lack of sympathy for what was going on.
As you described, there are many ways of interpreting who Jesus was identifying as the poor. And we, as you identified, have many different interpretations of what it means to be poor, that you can have all the money in the world and still be poor. You don't have good friends, you're poor. My reaction to reading that verse is always pretty much the same. It's one that strikes me and fills me with a bit of sadness that the declaration is, the poor you have with you always, that no matter how hard you try to address the poverty, you're still going to have poverty. No matter how hard you try and change the conditions and circumstances of the poor, you're still going to have the poor. And it's sad because, I mean, the way it always hits me, you're going to always have the poor because you're always going to have someone who's trying to get more at the expense of another. Because we just can't learn the lesson that you just ended up with. We can't learn the lesson of better to give than to receive, that we have to share. I mean, how often do we hear, some of you might even say it, how often do we hear that there is food and enough in the U.S. for no one to be hungry anywhere? But you still have hunger. Why? The poor you have with you always, because of the same reasons. Other comments? Yes, sir. He's handing you the mic right there in the back.
Thank you very much. As I am reflecting on the ones who want more as the poor, I am reflecting on the first thought that I had from the first reading. Thus says the Lord, I will do a new thing. Mm-hmm. And as I was reflecting on the second reading, it says that God brought the exiles into care. And then this precious moment of, I'm looking at, again, the creative tension. I was not looking too much at the poverty element of the humans and the context, but rather the creative tension between Mary and Martha. Martha's doing all the work, and Mary is having a great time in the fiesta. You know, we Latino people, we like fiesta a lot. But at the same time, I am reflecting on the immigrants and the tremendous suffering of immigrants. About 4 million people have been deported. Last year alone, more than 1 million families torn apart. And so I am invited to reflect on how to bring this Lenten season and this moment of thinking, reflecting, and praying to my leaders who are also in despair, many of my leaders. And so, anyway, I thank you for that wonderful idea that the context is also allowing me to read the text a different way as I am moving towards Martin Luther King, this ambition that there is a possibility. It happened in the United States in the 60s. It can happen again. 1/3 of the money we spend on war making can be used for feeding people, educating us. Anyway, I'm getting too poetic here. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Well, our time is up, and I thank you very much for your attention and your participation.